HOA workers nailed a fresh community property sign onto the first of my 15 lake cabins at 6:12 in the morning. Diane Harper stood behind them with a clipboard, telling two contractors to keep moving down the row before I could stop them. My cabins lined the north shore, still smelling of cedar, lake mist, and last night's rain. At the end of that same gravel lane sat the only access road into the entire HOA subdivision. That road was not just pavement. It was a recorded private corridor tied to a deed in my name. If Diane tried to claim my cabins while blocking that road, she was dragging every homeowner behind her into a legal choke point she had never bothered to read. Then a tour cart full of buyers rolled past cabin 3. That was when I realized they were already selling the lie. The cart tires hissed over the wet gravel as it slowed near the dock. A man in a navy polo pointed at my cabins like he was showing off model homes. Two couples leaned out with coffee cups in their hands. One woman lifted her phone and took a picture of the sign hanging crooked on my porch rail. The hammering continued farther down the shoreline. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Each hit carried across the water. My hand tightened around the gate key in my pocket. The metal edge pressed into my palm. Diane saw me standing near the boat shed and smiled. Not a nervous smile, a victory smile. She walked toward me in white capri pants and a pale blue blazer, heels clicking against the gravel like she owned the ground under them. "Ethan," she said, sweet and sharp at the same time. "You are making this harder than it needs to be. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 44 years old, and those cabins are not abandoned rentals or forgotten vacation shacks. I rebuilt every one of them after my father passed. New roofs, new docks, new wiring, fresh stone paths between the porches. 15 cabins facing the lake, each one paid for, permitted, and recorded under my property company." Diane knew the cabins looked valuable. She did not know what connected them to the road behind her. A second cart appeared from the subdivision entrance. This one carried 3 HOA board members and a man in a gray suit. I did not recognize. The air smelled like wet pine and diesel from a generator near the staging tent. Someone had set up a table with brochures. I saw the words Lakeshore Retreat Expansion printed across the top in glossy blue letters. My cabins were on the cover. My dock was on the cover. Even my father's old fishing pier was on the cover. Diane followed my eyes and tapped her clipboard. "The board voted last night," she said. "The cabins fall inside our planned community boundary." I looked past her at the access road curving through the trees. "Boundary is not ownership." Her smile tightened. A lake bird skimmed low over the water. The morning felt suddenly quiet beneath the hammering. Diane leaned closer. "You can fight this if you want," she said. "But every resident wants that resort open by summer." Behind her, the man in the gray suit unfolded a large map across the brochure table. The board members gathered around it. Then I saw the red line drawn straight through my access road. The red line on that map stayed in my head long after Diane walked away. The board members clustered around the table, smiling and shaking hands. One of them handed brochures to the visitors from the tour cart. The glossy paper snapped in the breeze coming off the lake. I stepped closer. Nobody stopped me. That surprised me. Diane usually liked an audience when she thought she was winning. The man in the gray suit pointed at the map with a silver pen. "Future guest parking," he said. Then he moved the pen toward my cabins. "Lakeside lodging." Several people nodded. One couple even applauded. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the refreshment tent. A portable speaker played cheerful music near the shoreline. The whole scene looked like a celebration. That was the problem. They were celebrating property they did not own. I studied the map for another few seconds. One detail stood out immediately. The red line crossed the access road and continued straight toward the subdivision entrance. That line should never have been there. A board member noticed me staring. He folded his arms. "Everything all right, Ethan?" I looked at him. "Who drew this map?" His smile faded slightly. "The planning committee." That was not an answer. Diane stepped back into the conversation before I could ask another question. "The community is moving forward," she said. "The residents support it." Behind her, another contractor attached a sign to cabin 6. The metallic click of the drill echoed across the water. I watched a family walk past the cabin and read the new sign. One child pointed toward the dock and smiled. His parents looked impressed. They believed the brochures. They believed the presentation. They had no idea what they were standing on. A small detail caught my attention again. Near the bottom corner of the map sat a faded parcel reference number. It looked familiar. Very familiar. Diane noticed my eyes drop to the corner. She slid the map slightly. Not enough to hide it. Just enough to make me notice she was trying. That tiny movement told me more than anything she had said all morning. Something on that map mattered. The wind shifted. The scent of wet cedar drifted from cabin 2. I turned away from the crowd and walked toward my truck. Nobody followed me. Nobody thought they needed to. Diane believed the board vote had already ended the fight. The lake shimmered behind the cabins. Sunlight flashed across the water between the docks. Everything looked peaceful from a distance. Up close, it felt different. A project this large required surveys, boundary reviews, parcel references, access documentation. Somebody had assembled that map from somewhere. I opened the truck door and reached behind the seat. A cardboard archive box sat where it always had. Inside were maintenance records, permits, inspection reports, and older property documents. Papers most people would never bother reading. I flipped through several folders. Dust lifted into the warm air. Then I found a county survey packet from years earlier. The same parcel number appeared near the top corner. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. That only happened when something started making sense. I looked back toward the shoreline. Diane was laughing with the visitors again. The board members looked completely relaxed. They should not have been. Then I saw the date printed beneath the parcel number. The date beneath the parcel number was 17 years older than the HOA itself. I stood beside my truck and read it twice. The paper crackled in the breeze coming off the lake. Behind me, cheerful music still drifted from the event tent. Laughter carried across the shoreline. Diane was still giving tours. The contrast felt almost surreal. One side of the property looked like a resort launch. The other looked like the beginning of an investigation. I flipped through the survey packet again. The parcel reference appeared on 3 different pages. Each page connected to the same corridor of land. The same strip of gravel and pavement winding through the trees from the county road to the subdivision entrance. I traced the line with my finger. A small note sat beside it. That note stopped me. It was not highlighted. It was not bold. Most people would have skipped right past it. Someone had handwritten an amendment reference in the margin years ago. I looked back toward the brochure table. Diane was showing visitors another oversized map. The board members looked proud. One of them pointed toward cabin 11 while speaking to a family. A child ran down the dock laughing. The smell of sunscreen mixed with cedar and lake water. Everything around them depended on that road. Every delivery truck, every utility crew, every contractor, every homeowner. The realization settled quietly. Then it stayed there. I climbed into the truck and opened my laptop. Cell service along the lake was never great, but it was enough. The county archive portal loaded slowly. I entered the amendment reference exactly as it appeared on the survey packet. A loading symbol spun across the screen. Then a document appeared. My eyes moved directly to the attached exhibit map. There it was again. The same corridor. The same route. The same parcel. Another vehicle pulled into the parking area near the cabins. A landscaping company truck. The driver checked in with HOA volunteers before heading toward the subdivision. Nobody questioned whether he could use the road. Nobody thought about who actually controlled it. The amendment file contained several scanned pages. I enlarged one section. The image quality was poor. Age had faded parts of the text. Still, one phrase remained readable. Exclusive access easement. I sat back in the seat. The air conditioner hummed softly. Outside, a drill started again near cabin 8. Another sign was going up. Diane was moving fast. Faster than before. That told me something too. She wanted public support locked in before anyone started asking technical questions. A knock on my passenger window interrupted my thoughts. I looked up. It was Frank Dalton. Frank had worked as a land surveyor in the county for nearly 40 years before retiring. He owned a small fishing cabin on the far side of the lake. We had known each other for years. Saw the crowd, he said through the glass. Figured trouble found you again. I handed him the survey packet without saying much. Frank adjusted his glasses and studied the page. The breeze flipped one corner upward. He held it down and kept reading. The smile disappeared from his face. Then he turned directly to the amendment reference. He did not ask where I found it. He did not ask why it mattered. He already knew. Frank looked toward the subdivision entrance. Then he looked back at me. Ethan, he said quietly. They built their entire future around the wrong line. Frank kept staring toward the subdivision entrance. The afternoon sun reflected off his glasses. Behind us, Another tour group rolled past the cabins in a golf cart. The guide pointed toward the shoreline and spoke about future expansion. Nobody noticed the two of us standing beside my truck. Nobody noticed the old survey packet resting between us. That was the strange part. The biggest problem on the property was hidden inside paperwork. Frank lowered the documents and looked directly at me. "Do they know about this?" he asked. "I do not think so," I said. He nodded slowly. The breeze pushed across the lake again. Leaves rustled along the tree line. Somewhere near cabin 9, a contractor started another power tool. The sound echoed across the water. Frank opened the amendment file again. He flipped to the exhibit map and traced the corridor with one finger. This line was revised after the original. "Subdivision concept," he said. "Most people never look at the amendment records." That detail stayed with me. Most people never look. Diane had spent the entire day convincing residents that ownership was obvious. Yet everything I was seeing suggested the opposite. Across the shoreline, volunteers were setting up a presentation board beside the brochure tent. More visitors had arrived. The crowd was growing. Diane wanted momentum. Every hour mattered to her. Frank folded the survey packet and handed it back. "You need the complete archive file," he said. "Not summaries. Not copies. The full chain." Then he walked toward his pickup without another word. I watched him leave. His reaction bothered me more than his warning. Frank was not dramatic. He spent decades reading land records and boundary surveys. If he looked concerned, there was usually a reason. I climbed back into my truck and returned to the county archive portal. The signal fluctuated. The loading bar crawled across the screen. Then another file appeared. This one was older. Much older. Several scanned pages carried handwritten signatures. Some sections were difficult to read. Others were crystal clear. I enlarged one page. The paper showed signs of age. Faded ink. Yellowed edges. Official recording stamps. Then I found another reference number. Different document. Same corridor. My attention narrowed. The noise outside faded into the background. I followed the references one by one. Each led farther backward through the property history. Every document pointed toward the same narrow strip of land. The access route. The only practical way into the subdivision. A knock interrupted me again. This time it was not Frank. It was one of the homeowners from the community, a man named Robert. He lived near the subdivision entrance. "You coming to the meeting tonight?" he asked. "What meeting?" I said. "The board presentation." He glanced toward the tent. "They are unveiling the final resort plan." That caught my attention immediately. Final plan. Not proposal. Not concept. Final plan. Diane was moving even faster than I thought. Robert thanked me and walked away. I looked toward the brochure tent again. A large banner had just been raised beside the shoreline. The wind stretched the fabric tight. Resort expansion vision. The words were visible from half a mile away. People gathered around it with phones raised. The atmosphere felt more like a launch than a discussion. Then another page loaded on my screen. My eyes stopped on a recorded deed entry. The grantor name was familiar. Very familiar. I had seen it before. Not in the HOA records. In my father's files. Then I realized where the next answer was waiting. I left the truck parked beside the boat shed and headed toward the storage room behind cabin 1. The late afternoon sun hung low over the lake. Long shadows stretched across the docks. The music from the HOA event still drifted through the trees, but it sounded farther away now. My father's records were stored in a narrow cedar building that smelled like old paper, motor oil, and lake water. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall. Most people would have seen clutter. I saw history. I pulled open the third cabinet and started working through folders. Tax receipts, maintenance logs, dock permits, insurance renewals. Then I found a thick binder with my father's handwriting across the front. Land records. I carried it to a workbench and opened it. The pages were worn from years of use. Several corners were folded. Notes filled the margins. My father had never trusted verbal promises. He documented everything. That habit had saved him more than once. It might save me now. I turned page after page. Outside, I could hear distant applause from the shoreline. Diane was probably still presenting her expansion plan. Another mini hook nagged at me. If she was so confident, why had she tried to hide part of the map? I kept reading. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. A small metal fan hummed in the corner. The air smelled warm and dry. Finally, a familiar grantor name appeared. The same name I had seen in the county archive. My pulse steadied. I flipped to the attached documents. There was a survey exhibit, then another, then a recorded transfer. Each one referenced the same corridor, leading from the county highway through the woods toward the subdivision entrance. I laid the pages side by side across the workbench. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every record connected back to a single ownership chain. None of them listed the HOA. Not once. I leaned closer. A handwritten note from my father sat beside one survey copy. He rarely underlined anything, but this sentence was marked twice. Access corridor must remain separate from future subdivision parcels. I read it again, then again. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavier. A vehicle door slammed outside. I looked through the dusty window. 2 HOA board members were walking along the shoreline. They were showing visitors the cabins again. One of them pointed toward the far end of the property. The confidence in their body language almost made me laugh. They were acting like owners. They were standing on assumptions. I returned to the binder. Tucked into the back pocket was a large folded document. The paper crackled as I opened it. It was the original survey map, bigger than the copies, sharper than the digital scans. Every boundary line was visible. Every notation was legible. Then I saw what Frank had probably realized before I did. The corridor was not merely adjacent to my property. It was legally tied to the same ownership chain that eventually transferred into my company's holdings years later. The implication was enormous. Every resident, every contractor, every service vehicle, every guest, every board member, they all depended on that route every single day. Outside, a golf cart rolled past with another group of visitors. Their laughter echoed across the water. Inside the storage room, I folded the survey carefully and slid it back into its sleeve. My phone vibrated on the workbench. A new community email notification had arrived. The subject line mentioned an emergency board presentation scheduled for that evening. Then I noticed where the meeting was being held. The meeting location was the first thing that made me stop. Diane had scheduled the emergency board presentation inside the old Marina Lodge near the subdivision entrance. The same lodge that sat only a few 100 feet from the access corridor. The same corridor that appeared over and over in every document I had reviewed that afternoon. I looked at the email again. Attendance encouraged. Future development discussion. Community vote update. The wording sounded harmless. The timing did not. Outside, the sky had started turning orange over the lake. Sunlight reflected across the water in long bands of gold. The noise from the shoreline event was finally fading. Vendors were packing equipment. Visitors were leaving. Diane had spent the entire day building momentum. Tonight she planned to turn that momentum into pressure. I locked the storage room and carried the binder back to my truck. The leather cover felt heavier now, not because of the paper, because of what the paper meant. A small boat crossed the lake in the distance. Its wake rolled slowly toward the docks. The evening air smelled like pine and warm cedar. Everything looked calm, yet every new document seemed to make the situation larger. I drove toward the Marina Lodge just before sunset. Cars already filled the gravel parking area. Residents stood outside in small groups talking. Several people carried brochures from the morning presentation. Others wore HOA committee badges. As I stepped from the truck, conversations briefly softened. Then they resumed. News traveled quickly in communities like this. Most people already knew there was a dispute. Very few understood what the dispute was actually about. I entered the lodge. The room buzzed with conversation. Folding chairs stretched across the floor. A projector screen stood at the front beside a large display board. Diane moved through the crowd greeting residents. She looked confident, relaxed, like someone preparing to announce a victory. The board members looked the same. I took a seat near the back. Not hidden, just quiet. A few residents nodded at me. Others avoided eye contact. The smell of coffee drifted from a refreshment table near the entrance. The projector fan hummed softly. Then the lights dimmed. Diane stepped forward. The room settled. She thanked everyone for attending. She spoke about community growth, property values, tourism, opportunities, future investments. The crowd listened carefully. Every few minutes she received approving nods. Then the first map appeared on the screen. I recognized it immediately. The same map from the shoreline presentation. The same red line. The same corridor. Diane spoke with complete certainty. She described future guest access, expanded parking, resort lodging, recreational facilities. Every major feature depended on infrastructure she assumed belonged to the community. Another mini hoax surfaced in my mind. Assumed. Not verified. Assumed. Several residents began asking questions. Most focused on construction schedules and future revenue. Diane answered each one smoothly. Then a homeowner near the center aisle raised his hand. It was Robert. Has the ownership review been completed? He asked. The room grew slightly quieter. Diane smiled. The board has reviewed all necessary information. A careful answer. Not the answer he asked for. I noticed two board members exchange a quick glance. Tiny movement. Easy to miss. Important anyway. Robert sat back down. Diane moved to the next slide. More renderings. More expansion plans. More applause. Yet the energy in the room had shifted. Only slightly. Enough to notice. Then another resident stood. An older woman who lived near the subdivision entrance. Will the project affect road access? She asked. Diane paused for half a second. Not long. Just long enough. Then she answered. There will be no issues regarding access. The confidence in her voice sounded rehearsed. My attention shifted toward the map again. Toward the corridor crossing the screen. Toward the same line everyone kept treating as settled fact. Then someone entered through the rear door carrying a large county records envelope. The room turned toward the rear door almost at the same time. Conversation stopped. Even the projector seemed louder for a moment. The man carrying the county records envelope stepped inside and paused near the entrance. He was not dressed like a resident. He wore a plain button-down shirt and carried a stack of documents under one arm. Diane noticed him immediately. Her smile faltered for the first time all evening. Not much. Just enough. The man approached one of the board members and quietly handed over the envelope. A few people leaned forward in their chairs. Curiosity spread across the room. The board member opened the flap and glanced inside. His expression changed. Then he looked at Diane. Another small detail. Another crack in the confidence she had displayed all day. Diane recovered quickly and continued her presentation. She clicked to another slide showing future cabin renovations and expanded lake access. Applause followed. But it sounded weaker now. Distracted. People were paying attention to the envelope. So was I? The man from the county moved to the side wall and took a seat near the back. He did not speak. He simply waited. That made the room even more curious. Diane continued talking about investment opportunities, revenue projections, property enhancements. Every few minutes she referred to areas she believed the HOA controlled. Every few minutes my attention returned to the corridor crossing her maps. The same corridor appearing in every document I had reviewed. The same corridor connected to every question nobody wanted to ask directly. Then another resident stood. This time, it was a retired contractor named Bill. Has an independent survey been completed? He asked. The room quieted again. Diane kept her smile in place. The board has reviewed all available property information. Another careful answer. Not the answer Bill requested. I noticed several homeowners exchange glances. They heard it too. The distinction mattered. Bill sat down slowly. Diane advanced to another slide. Yet momentum was slipping. Tiny piece by tiny piece. The evening had started as a celebration. Now it felt like an examination. The projector light cast pale colors across the front wall. The smell of coffee lingered in the air. Someone dropped a brochure. The paper fluttered to the floor. Small sounds suddenly seemed easier to hear. Diane wrapped up the presentation portion and opened the floor for discussion. Hands appeared immediately. More than before. Questions about permits. Questions about infrastructure. Questions about timelines. The board members shifted in their seats. Then Robert stood again. If access questions exist, he said, should the community verify ownership before voting? Several residents nodded. The county employee near the wall looked up from his folder. Diane answered before anyone else could speak. There are no access concerns. Her voice remained steady. Yet something about it felt different now. Tighter. Less relaxed. The county employee opened his folder and reviewed a page. He did not interrupt. He did not challenge her. He simply kept reading. Somehow that was more unsettling. I watched the board members carefully. One of them whispered to another. A second checked the contents of the envelope again. The confidence from the morning was fading. Not disappearing. Fading. The difference mattered. Confidence disappears all at once. Realization arrives in stages. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. Questions became more specific. Answers became shorter. Then Diane announced that a community vote would take place the following week. She expected approval. She said the project was moving forward. Several residents applauded politely. Others remained silent. Chairs scraped against the floor as people began standing. The meeting was ending. Yet the most important conversation had not happened. Not yet. As the crowd started filing toward the exits, the county employee finally rose from his chair and walked directly toward me. The county employee stopped a few feet from my chair and waited until most of the crowd had moved toward the exits. Folding chairs scraped across the floor. Conversations blended into a low hum. Diane remained near the projector screen speaking with board members. She kept smiling, but the energy around her had changed. The easy confidence from that morning was gone. The county employee extended his hand. "Ethan Walker?" he asked. I nodded. His handshake was brief. "Professional. My name is Daniel Mercer," he said. "County Records Division." That immediately had my attention. Daniel glanced toward the remaining residents. Then he lowered his voice. "I believe you have been reviewing some archived property documents." Not a question. A statement. I nodded again. "Hey." "Phew." Daniel opened his folder. Several pages sat inside. Some carried recording stamps. Others contained survey references. He carefully pulled one document free. "Interesting week," he said. The projector finally shut down behind us. The room became noticeably quieter. Diane looked in our direction for a moment. Then she returned to her conversation. Daniel placed a finger on one page. "The board recently requested ownership verification on multiple parcels." Another small piece clicked into place. Diane had not been as confident as she appeared. Somewhere behind the scenes, questions had already started. Daniel continued. "Several records required manual review." He paused. "That review uncovered inconsistencies." The word hung there. Inconsistencies. Not conclusions. Not accusations. Just enough to make people uncomfortable. I glanced toward the folder. "Regarding what?" Daniel studied me for a second. "Access documentation." There it was again. The same issue appearing from every direction. The same corridor surfacing in every conversation. Outside the lodge windows, darkness had settled across the lake. Reflections from parking lot lights shimmered against the glass. A few residents lingered near the entrance discussing the presentation. Others headed home. Yet I noticed something new. Several homeowners were looking toward Diane rather than away from her. Watching her. Evaluating her. The meeting had planted doubts. Daniel slid the document back into the folder. "Official review is ongoing," he said. "I cannot discuss details beyond that." Fair enough. He was not there to take sides. He was there because records existed. Facts existed. Documentation existed. Before leaving, he handed me a business card. "If additional materials surface, contact me." Then he walked toward the exit. I slipped the card into my pocket. Across the room, Diane finally approached. Two board members followed close behind. Her smile returned. Carefully controlled. "Interesting conversation," she said. "County records," I replied. "Routine stuff." She studied my face. Looking for something. A reaction. A weakness. I gave her neither. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Another kept glancing toward the folder Daniel had carried. Diane folded her arms. "The project is moving forward," she said. "Residents are excited." I looked around the room. Some residents looked excited. Others looked uncertain. More importantly, several were now asking questions. That was new. People usually get curious when documents start appearing, I said. Diane's expression hardened for a fraction of a second. Then it disappeared. "Good night, Ethan." She turned and walked away. The board members followed. I remained inside another few minutes. The lodge slowly emptied. Coffee cups sat abandoned on tables. Brochures covered several chairs. One had fallen open beside the aisle. The resort rendering stared back from glossy paper. Expensive docks. Expanded lodging. New parking. Everything depended on assumptions that looked less stable by the hour. I stepped outside. Cool night air rolled off the lake. Crickets chirped from the tree line. The subdivision entrance lights glowed beyond the access corridor. Vehicle after vehicle passed through without a second thought. Residents used that route every day. Most never considered who actually owned the ground beneath it. Then my phone vibrated with a new email from the county archive system. The email arrived before I even reached my truck. I stood under the parking lot lights and opened it immediately. The subject line contained nothing but a document reference number. No explanation. No message. just a link to a newly digitized archive file. The county system occasionally updated older records overnight. Apparently one had just become available. I sat inside the truck and opened the attachment. The screen glowed against the dark windshield. Crickets chirped outside. The first page appeared, then the second, then the third. My attention sharpened with every page. These were not summaries. These were original recordings. Full scans. Complete exhibits. The kind of records nobody bothered reading unless something had gone very wrong. I kept scrolling. The lake was almost invisible now beyond the trees. The only light came from scattered dock lamps and the subdivision entrance. Halfway through the file, I found a familiar survey sketch. Another mini hoax surfaced immediately. This version contained markings absent from the copies I had already seen. Handwritten notations filled the margins. Some referenced future development restrictions. Others referenced access maintenance obligations. Then I reached a recorded amendment page. I stopped moving entirely. The wording was clear. The corridor remained excluded from the subdivision transfer package. Excluded. Not overlooked. Not forgotten. Excluded. Deliberately. I read the paragraph twice. Then 3 times. A pickup truck rolled through the access corridor outside. Its headlights swept across the trees before disappearing into the community. Every homeowner continued using the road without thinking about it. Yet the paper in front of me told a very different story. I saved copies of every page and drove back to the cabins. The shoreline was quiet now. Event tents had been removed. Most visitors were gone. The new HOA signs remained attached to several cabins. They looked even more ridiculous under the dock lights. I carried the binder and laptop into cabin 1. The smell of cedar greeted me as I stepped inside. A table near the window quickly disappeared beneath maps, surveys, deeds, and printed records. Hours passed. Midnight arrived. Then 1 in the morning. I organized every document chronologically. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every ownership transfer had been carefully documented. Every amendment referenced the same corridor. Every survey reinforced the same boundary. Yet the HOA presentation maps treated the corridor as if it belonged to them automatically. Assumption after assumption. Layer after layer. Around 1:30, my phone buzzed. A message from Frank appeared. Still awake? I called him instead. He answered immediately. You found something, he said. Not a question. I did. I explained what the new archive file contained. Silence followed. Then Frank exhaled slowly. That explains a lot. I looked down at the documents spread across the table. What am I missing? Another pause. Ethan, years ago there was a proposed transfer package. Some people assumed everything moved together. Most never. Check the final recordings. He stopped. The final recordings matter. The conversation lasted another 15 minutes. When it ended, I understood something important. This was no longer just about the cabins. Diane's project depended on legal certainty. Investors expected certainty. Residents expected certainty. Contractors expected certainty. Yet the foundation beneath their plan looked increasingly unstable. I finally stepped onto the porch just before dawn. Cool air rolled across the lake. The water reflected faint traces of early morning light. Somewhere in the distance, a boat engine started. The subdivision entrance sat quiet beyond the trees. For now, my phone vibrated again. Another message had arrived. This one came from a homeowner I barely knew. Then a second arrived. Then a third. Residents had started asking questions. By sunrise, the questions had spread farther than I expected. My phone kept vibrating on the kitchen counter inside cabin 1. Residents wanted clarification. Some asked about the resort proposal. Others asked about surveys. A few asked directly about access rights. The tone had changed overnight. Curiosity was replacing certainty. I poured coffee and stepped onto the porch. Mist hovered above the lake. The docks creaked softly against their pilings. Across the shoreline, the HOA signs still hung on several cabins. They looked less like declarations now and more like assumptions waiting to be tested. Another message arrived. Then another. One came from Robert. He wanted to meet. An hour later, we sat at a picnic table near the marina. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted from a maintenance crew working nearby. Robert looked tired. People are talking, he said. About what? I asked. He laughed quietly. Everything. That answer told me enough. Rumors had escaped the boardroom. Once that happened, they rarely returned. Robert leaned forward. A few homeowners started checking records themselves. That caught my attention, and he looked toward the subdivision entrance. They are finding things that do not match the presentation. A golf cart rolled past carrying 2 residents. Both glanced toward us before continuing down the path. The atmosphere around the community felt different, less celebratory, more cautious. Around mid-morning, another development arrived. The county scheduled an informational review session for the following week. Not a hearing, not a ruling, a review session. Still, the timing mattered. News of it moved through the neighborhood quickly. By noon, people were discussing it at the marina, the mail kiosk, and even near the boat launch. Diane responded the only way she knew how. She doubled down. By early afternoon, the HOA distributed a new email reassuring residents that development plans remained on schedule. The message sounded polished, confident, yet one sentence stood out. It stated that all critical infrastructure questions had already been resolved. I read that line twice. Then I saved a copy. Across the lake, clouds drifted slowly overhead. The day felt unusually still. Around 3 o'clock, Frank called. "Meet me at the old survey marker near the corridor," he said. "You need to see something." 20 minutes later, we stood beside a weathered metal marker half hidden by brush. Vehicles occasionally passed along the corridor nearby. Most drivers never noticed it. Frank brushed dirt away from the base. The engraved identification number was still visible. "This marker appears on the original survey," he said. "Same position, same reference." He handed me a copy of an old plat map. The alignment matched perfectly. Another piece clicked into place. Not a dramatic discovery, just confirmation. The strongest evidence often worked that way. Quiet, precise, difficult to argue with. Frank folded the map and slipped it back into its tube. "People keep focusing on the cabins," he said. "That is not the real story." I already knew what he meant. Every conversation eventually returned to the same corridor. Every document pointed there. Every assumption depended on it. As evening approached, activity around the subdivision slowed. Yet online community discussions became more active. Residents shared screenshots. Questions multiplied. One board member reportedly resigned from a planning subcommittee. Another requested an independent review. Small developments. Important developments. The certainty Diane had relied on was eroding around the edges. After sunset, I returned to cabin 1 and organized the growing stack of documents. The binder from my father sat open beside the laptop. Survey copies covered the table. Outside, lake water lapped softly against the dock. Then a new email notification appeared. This one was from Diane herself. The email from Diane arrived at 8:17 that evening. I opened it while sitting at the table covered with surveys, deeds, and county records. The message was short. Too short. She requested a private meeting the following morning at the marina office. No board members. No attorneys. No explanation. Just a time and location. I read it twice. Then I looked out the window toward the dark water. Small waves tapped against the dock. The lake reflected scattered lights from cabins along the shoreline. For the first time since this started, Diane was asking for a conversation instead of making announcements. That alone told me something had changed. I arrived at the marina office just after sunrise. The air smelled like wet wood and fresh coffee. A maintenance crew was already working near the boat launch. Diane was waiting on the porch. She held a folder under one arm. Her usual confidence was still there, but it looked strained around the edges. We stepped inside. The office overlooked the water through a wall of windows. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Diane placed the folder on the table. "Things have become more complicated than expected," she said. It was the closest thing to an admission I had heard from her. I remained quiet. Silence often revealed more than questions. Diane opened the folder. Inside were copies of surveys, planning drafts, and development proposals. Several pages looked familiar. Others did not. "The community wants answers," she said. "Investors want answers too." Another small detail stood out. Investors. She had never mentioned investors directly before. That meant pressure was coming from outside the neighborhood as well. Through the office window, I watched a delivery truck travel along the corridor toward the subdivision. Another reminder of what connected every part of this dispute. Diane noticed where I was looking. "People keep focusing on the road," she said. "Because it matters," I replied. She looked away for a moment. Not long. Just enough. We spoke for nearly 30 minutes. She asked what documents I had reviewed. I asked what assumptions the board had relied upon. Neither of us shared everything. Neither of us needed to. By the end of the conversation, one fact was clear. The board had moved forward long before completing a full ownership verification. Some records had been reviewed. Others had been assumed. That distinction was becoming expensive. As I left the marina office, several residents approached Diane before she could get back to her car. Questions followed her across the parking lot. She answered calmly, but the dynamic had changed. People were no longer listening automatically. They were evaluating. Later that afternoon, the county released additional scheduling information for the upcoming review session. Attendance would be open to residents. That news spread quickly. Community message boards exploded with discussion. Some homeowners supported the project. Others wanted everything paused until ownership questions were resolved. The neighborhood felt divided in a way I had never seen before. Around sunset, Robert stopped by Cabin 1 carrying printed copies of several community posts. We sat on the porch while the lake turned gold beneath the evening sky. People are digging through records now, he said. Lots of records. I scanned a few pages. Residents had found old meeting notes, archived maps, prior development proposals. The deeper they looked, the more questions appeared. One post contained a photograph from years earlier showing the corridor before the subdivision expanded. Another referenced an engineering review that few people remembered. Every new discovery seemed to point in the same direction. The foundation of the project was no longer being accepted at face value. After Robert left, I organized the newest documents into the binder. The stack had grown significantly. Outside, darkness settled across the shoreline. The cabins stood quiet beneath the trees. The HOA signs still hung where contractors had installed them. Yet nobody seemed interested in those signs anymore. Attention had shifted elsewhere. Toward records. Toward surveys. Toward the corridor. Then my phone lit up with a notification from the county review panel. The notification arrived just before midnight. I opened it immediately. The county review panel had finalized the agenda for the upcoming session. Several property questions would be addressed publicly. More importantly, supporting documents would be available for review before the meeting. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen for a moment. Outside, the lake was completely dark except for a few distant dock lights. The soft sound of water against the shoreline drifted through the open window. The process was finally moving into the open. No more rumors. No more assumptions. Documents would speak for themselves. The next morning, the community felt different. Residents were no longer talking about future resorts and grand openings. They were talking about surveys, deeds, easements, and ownership records. At the marina, conversations stopped when certain names came up. At the mail kiosk, people compared screenshots and archive references. Even contractors working near the shoreline seemed aware that something bigger was unfolding. I spent most of the morning organizing records for the review session. The binder that once fit comfortably inside a desk drawer now occupied half the table. Every document connected to another. Every survey referenced older surveys. Every ownership transfer led back to original recordings. The deeper I looked, the more consistent the pattern became. Around noon, Daniel Mercer called from the County Records Division. His voice sounded measured as always. Professional. Careful. The review panel has completed preliminary verification on several archived filings, he said. My attention sharpened immediately, and a brief pause followed. Several assumptions currently circulating in the community do not appear supported by the recorded chain. He chose his words carefully. He always did. Yet the meaning was clear enough. Facts were beginning to separate themselves from narratives. After the call ended, I walked down to the docks. A cool breeze moved across the lake. Boats rocked gently against their slips. The smell of water and cedar filled the air. Across the shoreline, homeowners went about their normal routines. Children rode bicycles. Couples walked dogs. Maintenance crews trimmed landscaping. Life continued. Yet beneath the surface, the community was waiting. Everyone knew the review session was approaching. Everyone knew answers were coming. Later that afternoon, another development rippled through the neighborhood. One of the board members publicly requested that the upcoming community vote be delayed until ownership questions were resolved. The statement spread quickly. By evening, screenshots appeared everywhere. Some residents supported the delay. Others accused the board of moving too fast. A few defended Diane. Many simply wanted clarity. The balance had shifted again. What once looked like a routine development proposal now looked like a complicated ownership dispute. As sunset approached, I received a message from Robert asking me to meet near the old Marina Lodge. We sat on a bench overlooking the water as orange light reflected across the lake. "Have you noticed something?" he asked. "What?" He nodded toward the subdivision. "People are not arguing about the cabins anymore." He was right. Attention had moved almost entirely toward access, toward the corridor, toward the question that connected everything. The cabins had become symbols. The real issue sat beneath every map and every proposal. Vehicles continued traveling through the corridor behind us. Residents entered and exited without giving it a second thought. Yet now everyone was asking the same question. Who actually controlled it? Darkness settled over the shoreline. Lights flickered on across the community. The atmosphere felt strangely calm considering everything happening beneath the surface, almost like the quiet before a summer storm. When I returned to Cabin 1, another envelope was waiting at my door. No return address. No note attached. Just a thick package containing copies of internal planning documents. I carried it inside and placed it on the table beside the binder. Then I opened the first page and immediately recognized a name I had not seen before. The name on the first page belonged to a consulting firm hired during the earliest planning stages. I had seen references to the company before, but never in this level of detail. The documents included internal recommendations, preliminary reviews, and meeting summaries. I sat at the table until well past midnight reading every page. Outside, the lake remained perfectly still. The only sounds came from distant insects and the occasional creak of the dock. The deeper I read, the clearer the picture became. One memo stood out above all the others. The consultant had specifically recommended a complete ownership verification before any expansion plans moved forward. The recommendation was highlighted. It was impossible to miss. Yet the proposal had continued anyway. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. For weeks, people had argued over assumptions. Now there was a documented warning sitting directly in front of me. The county review session arrived 3 days later. Residents filled the meeting room long before the scheduled start. Conversations echoed through the hallways. Some homeowners carried folders. Others carried printed maps. The atmosphere felt nothing like the celebration Diane had tried to create at the lake. This felt serious, deliberate, necessary. I took a seat near the center of the room. Daniel Mercer sat with county staff near the front. Several board members looked exhausted. Even Diane appeared different. Not defeated, just tired. The review panel began working through the records methodically. Survey after survey appeared on large screens. Ownership transfers were displayed. Archived filings were examined. Questions received answers. The process took hours. Nobody rushed. Nobody dramatized anything. Facts simply accumulated, piece by piece, document by document. Eventually, the discussion reached the issue that had consumed the community for weeks. The corridor. The room grew noticeably quieter. The review panel displayed the original surveys, the amendments, and the recorded transfers. Then they displayed the final ownership chain. No speculation remained. No assumptions remained. The record was clear. The corridor had never transferred with the subdivision parcels. It remained tied to the ownership chain that ultimately became part of my holdings. Several residents exchanged stunned looks. Others simply nodded. They had already begun reaching the same conclusion themselves. The review panel continued. Questions about development authority followed. Questions about access assumptions followed. More answers arrived. By the end of the session, the situation looked completely different from the version presented during the grand expansion proposal. When the meeting finally concluded, residents slowly filed toward the exits. Nobody was arguing anymore. Most people seemed relieved. The uncertainty was over. Outside, sunlight reflected across the lake. Small groups gathered in the parking lot discussing what they had heard. Diane stepped outside a few minutes later. For a moment, we stood facing the water without speaking. Then she exhaled and looked toward the shoreline. "I should have insisted on a complete review from the beginning," she said. It was not an excuse. It sounded more like acceptance. I nodded. That would have saved everyone a lot of trouble. She gave a small, tired smile. Probably. The weeks that followed were surprisingly calm. The HOA removed the signs from my cabins. The expansion proposal was withdrawn and rewritten from the ground up. Residents demanded stronger review procedures before future projects could move forward. Several board positions changed hands during the next election cycle. Most importantly, the community stopped relying on assumptions and started relying on records. One evening, nearly a month later, I stood on the dock watching the sunset spread across the lake. The cabins were quiet. Boats drifted lazily across the water. The corridor beyond the trees carried its usual stream of residents heading home. Everything looked ordinary again. Yet every time I glanced toward that road, I remembered how close an entire community came to building its future on the wrong foundation. In the end, the cabins stayed exactly where they belonged, and so did the truth.